Welcome to the CannMed Coffee Talk podcast, where we talk with the leading minds in cannabis science, medicine, cultivation, and safety testing. I am your host, Ben Amaralt. I'm the marketing manager at Medicinal Genomics and proud member of the team that puts on the CannMed conference every year. Head over to cannmedevents.com now to learn all about our CannMed 2021 event that will take place September 29th through October 1st at the Pasadena Convention Center in Pasadena, California. And be sure to get your tickets at our special early bird rate. While you're at cannmedevents.com, be sure to sign up for email alerts to stay up to date with all the news surrounding this industry-leading event. The best place to do that is on our podcast page, which you can find in the main menu under the Media tab. You can also go there directly by going to cannmedevents.com/coffeetalk. There is a sign-up form on that page, and if you complete it, you will be entered into a drawing to win 2 CannMed 2021 VIP dinner tickets. While you're there, you can also listen to all the CannMed Coffee Talk podcast episodes in our archive. On this episode, we talk with Van Butsic, the co-director of the Berkeley Cannabis Research Center and Cooperative Extension Specialist at UC Berkeley. The Cannabis Research Center uses an interdisciplinary approach to address questions at the intersection of cannabis policy, the environment, and cannabis-producing communities. At CannMed 2021, Van will participate in the panel discussion about the environmental impacts of cannabis production. In our conversation, we discuss why it's important to better understand how cannabis cultivation affects the environment, how cannabis compares to other crops in terms of its environmental impact, how outdoor cannabis cultivation affects rivers and streams, the challenge of collecting data on unpermitted cannabis farms, and how easing the permit and licensure requirements for farmers could lead to better environmental outcomes. Before we get to my conversation with Van, I'd like to thank this episode's sponsor, Colorado Seed. Colorado Seed is a cannabis genetics company based out of Boulder, Colorado. They're innovators of cannabis cultivation and breeding techniques and have been locally producing licensed cannabis seeds since 2008, specializing in high-potency, unique breeding lines suitable for both home and commercial grows. For more information, go to coloradoseedinc.com. And lastly, it wouldn't be the CannMed Coffee Talk podcast without some good coffee. And for that, we always turn to the Hemp and Coffee Exchange. If you don't know, hemp coffee is a healthy, delicious, natural product rich in trace minerals and nutrients, providing sustained energy without the crash of regular coffee. For more information, check out hempcoffeeexchange.com and use the promo code DRINKHEMP to get 10% off your purchase. Okay, without any further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Van Butsic. Good morning, Van. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
All right, and you are the co-director of the Cannabis Research Center at UC Berkeley. I was wondering if you could briefly explain to the listeners what is the work that you do there.
Sure. So the Cannabis Research Center is a group of interdisciplinary scholars who focus on the intersection of cannabis, cannabis policy, cannabis producing communities, and the environment. So I think that the sort of three most important parts of our work is one, we're interdisciplinary. We have natural sciences, people who are ecologists and freshwater scientists. We have social scientists, we have anthropologists in our group. We have people from the law school in our group. We have geographers in our group. We have economists in our group. So that's one of the key things is our research really tries to take a 360-degree look at cannabis issues. The second sort of important part of our group is that we're really focused on sort of the communities that produce cannabis, the policies that impact cannabis, and then broadly how they're all related to the natural environment. So we're interested in sort of how policy changes how farmers act, and then how that output leads to environmental changes. So we're sort of have a niche where we're not sort of focused on the health side of things. We're really focused sort of on this environment and community side of things. And then the third thing that I think makes our center unique is we're really interested in being sort of active participants in the cannabis space insofar as we're interested in our research informing policy and public decisions. So we do a lot of outreach. We try to make our research accessible to the broad public and try to make sure that our research is useful to policymakers and the public as they make decisions.
Excellent. And why do you think it's important to better understand the environmental impacts of cannabis cultivation? Like, what's at stake?
That's a great question. Um, you know, a bit of background. So I started researching cannabis probably 6 or 7 years ago. And at the time, we were seeing a lot of really nice pieces in the popular press about some of the environmental impacts of outdoor cannabis cultivation. And my thought as a researcher was, well, is this like really going on? Is this the case? Are we seeing these big impacts? And of course, when we started digging into it, what we found was a pretty complex story. And we found, of course, that a lot of the information was just unknown, right? There wasn't data about these impacts. So to a large extent, a lot of the work we've done is just trying to set a baseline of trying to understand like what's actually happening um, with cannabis and the environment. Are these effects something that we need to be focused on? What's at stake with cannabis cultivation and the environment, I think, is two things. First, historically, cannabis has been cultivated in remote areas of the world. And this is true in California, where we have sort of historical cultivation spots up in the Emerald Triangle, which are really difficult to sort of access. But it's actually true sort of internationally as well. The areas where cannabis has been grown in Thailand or other places across the globe are usually, in remote areas. And these remote areas also are oftentimes of high sort of environmental values, right? So these are areas that have a lot of natural value to us, have not been developed into cities and suburbs yet. So there's sort of this natural intersection of places where cannabis has historically been grown and at high environmental values. The second sort of part to the question of what's at stake is we think because cannabis regulation is sort of starting from scratch, there's the potential for how cannabis is regulated as an agricultural crop relative to the environment to change how we think about sort of agricultural regulation broadly. So, for example, in California, uh, the the environmental standards to which cannabis farmers are held are generally higher than what we would see for other agricultural crops, right? There's a lot more permitting involved. It's basically all organic. And a big question is, well, if we can figure out how to make the cannabis industry successful while meeting these really high environmental standards, can this be a model that can be expanded to all of agriculture?
And how do you go about collecting the data to do your analysis?
So we use, we have this interdisciplinary team, so we use sort of mixed methods. And so our data collection involves a lot of different things. So, personally, my work has basically used, I come from a background of sort of economics and geography. And so the first thing I did was I wanted to know, well, how many cannabis farms are there and where are they at? And so we used remote sensing data, high resolution satellite data, basically what you see if you go to Google Earth and you get the highest resolution data possible. And we use that to identify cannabis grows throughout different areas of California. So that kind of gave us like a spatial footprint of where these farms were, how big they were, how they were changing over time. And then we have there's starting to be some pretty good data coming from the state. So in California, basically cannabis users or cannabis producers need to record their water usage. So we're starting to get a pretty good idea of how much water cannabis producers are using and where that water is coming from. And so that's sort of data collected as part of the permitting process in the state. And there's a number of other sort of interesting data pieces that are coming out from the permitting process as well. Of course, those don't that data doesn't cover non-permitted farms. And so to get at non-permitted farms and what non-permitted farmers are doing, we've done a lot of survey work. So we've done two large surveys of cannabis farmers, both permitted and unpermitted, focused primarily in California and a little bit in Southern Oregon. And we're going to have another survey kicking off next year. So basically, this combination of like satellite data, so collected from satellites, data that we can get from the permitted industry through sort of records requests to the state, and then the third one is sort of asking growers themselves through surveys.
Interesting. I wonder what sort of incentives do you need to um, what sort of incentives do you need to use to encourage some of the non-permitted people to give up their information? I imagine that might be a
Yeah,
little tricky.
yeah, it is tricky. I think the surveys we've done, and what I want to say that I think we've been able to get pretty good participation by non-permitted growers, but I think there's probably a certain type of non-permitted grower who we're not getting participation from, right? Who just
Right.
has no interest in sort of giving this information. I think that the type of non-permitted farmer we're getting is someone who, if the economic situation was a little different in the permanent market, and if it was a little bit easier to get permitted, might be interested in it. But for now, is sort of staying on the outside. Um, I think for a lot of non-permitted farmers, they feel like they're sort of vilified, right? They're seeing sort of this press about the negative impacts of cannabis on the environment, and usually that is blaming sort of the non-permitted growers. And there's a lot of non-permitted growers who are using, totally environmentally sustainable production techniques and are not getting permitted for other reasons, not related to, their care for the environment at all. And I think that there's plenty of growers who want to be able to tell that story and want that story told. And so I think that's the incentive for them to do the survey work, do the surveys is, if they feel like they're not being represented fairly, this is a chance for the data to show what they're actually doing.
Right, that makes sense. Okay, so we've sort of set up what the mission is for your group and how you're collecting data. What have you found so far?
Yeah, we found a number of things. I mean, and I'm going to give a little bit of plug here. If the listeners want to check out our website, which is uh, crc.berkeley.edu. So this is the CRC, the Cannabis Research Center, crc.berkeley.edu. We have something we call our science briefs, which are basically distilled versions of our peer-reviewed work. And I think we have three of them up right now. We have two more that are in production. And this will give you like a really good overview of all the research we've done without having to go read the primary academic work. The primary academic work is also on our website, so you're welcome to check that out as well. But what have we found? Generally, I think what we found is that one, there's a lot of cannabis farms, most of which are unpermitted in Cal, and this is related to California. So almost all of our research thus far has been California focused. Um, there's a lot of research. Most of it is related to California. Sorry, there's a lot of farms. Most of the farms are unpermitted. So, probably a quarter maybe are permitted at this point, probably maybe less.
Oh, wow.
It's hard to put a number on it.
Now,
Uh,
is that in number of farms, or is that just sort of the percentage of the overall kind of footprint?
yeah, no, that's a great question. So that's the number of farms. What we have found is that the farms that get permitted are on average much larger than the farms that don't get permitted.
Yeah,
So I
that makes
think
sense.
that the amount of acreage that's permitted is certainly higher than the number of farms, um, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does
Yeah,
make sense. I guess it's much harder to hide a big farm.
yeah. I think it's about hiding, and it's also just about cost, right? So, I mean, the cost to permit a big farm is not all that different than the cost to permit a small farm, um, and so you have some economies of scale there. There are different sort of license fees for different size farms, but most the cost is not actually like the fees you're paying to the state or the county, it's usually the upgrades you have to make to your facility before it can get permitted. And those oftentimes are not actually related to the farm itself. So a good example is, in Mendocino and Humboldt County, where a lot of people have sort of these long private dirt roads going back to the farms. Uh, to get your permit, the whole road leading to the farm has to meet certain environmental standards. And so you might have to replace, three or four or five culverts along the road before you can get your cannabis permit. And so, replacing those culverts costs the same amount whether you're permitting a quarter acre or 2 acres of land. And so, I think there's some real economies of scale in the permitting process for the larger farms.
Okay. I didn't mean to derail you there, but I think you're
Yeah, yeah, okay, right. So what did we find? So lots of farms, most of them are non-permitted, and most of them are still small, right? So I mean, relative to other types of agriculture. So most farms are still less than an acre in California, um, which is still a really small farm space-wise, and even the larger farms are still relatively small, right? Even I think the biggest farms we have are maybe approaching 30 or 40 acres now, and that's still a pretty small farm. Related to farm size, we see a gradient basically with smaller farms in the northern part of the state, and then the farms getting larger as you move into the central coast and southern California, with Santa Barbara sort of having the most acreage and area. From an environmental perspective, what does that mean? Basically, it means that we haven't seen, cannabis become like a dominant land cover type in most parts of the state. Um, we we haven't seen huge amounts of timber removal from cannabis, although we have seen some. Um, on the water use side, what we found is that it's really about the timing of the water use and not so much the amount of water. So cannabis seems to use about the same amount of water as any other agricultural plant. 2 to 3 acre feet of water per year. Um, the conflict, and this is somewhat California specific, but the conflict occurs because California is grown in the summer, cannabis is grown in the summer. Um, in California, we have drought conditions every summer. That's just we have a Mediterranean climate, so we generally don't get any rain from say May till October. Um, and so the plants require irrigation. This is the same time that, of course, the streams and rivers are at their lowest point, because there hasn't been any rain for a number of months. And so there's a conflict there. What we found is that this conflict can be mediated through storage. So if farmers can store water in the winter and then use it in the summer, that works really well. Um, of course, there's some issues with storage insofar as it's expensive and you need to have enough. Um, but we have found that it does seem like some of these water-related conflicts can be mitigated through good planning and investment in storage.
Yeah, and that stood out to me when I was reading the brief you put together about water usage, and I imagine from a cultivator standpoint, the fact that the summers are dry in California is a good thing because um, coming from the Northeast and having limited experience with
Right.
cannabis cultivation, the hardest part is when you have flowering plants and you get into the wet and raw part of the year, you have an issue with mold and other
Right.
unwanted effects. So um, it's just interesting to me that there's a benefit there, but obviously there's an environmental trade off with the water usage.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably right on. I mean, I think there's a lot of benefits to the climate out here for growing and having this low humidity for especially the latter part of the season when plants are flowering. Um, but yeah, it does line up to exactly when you don't want to be taking water from the environment. Um, so storage is important. We also see a lot of people using groundwater, so using wells. Um, we have some concerns that, the wells are, of course, connected hydrologically oftentimes to the surface water flows. So, making sure that if people are using wells, there's not too many wells on one stream, and they're not hydrologically connected to the surface water, or the people are using the wells in the winter to pump water into storage, which works really nicely as well.
And now I'm curious, how do your findings change when you kind of look at indoor cultivation versus outdoor cultivation?
So far we haven't done a whole lot with indoor cultivation, and there's a few reasons for that. First is that sort of indoor cultivation, environmental impacts are more or less regulated by the municipalities. So, um, for example, water use, a municipality, is charging a rate for the water use, and the cannabis grower is paying that rate using the water, and then it's probably going into a sewer system where the water is treated. So we're not particularly concerned about the environmental impacts of indoor cannabis production in the same way we are outdoor cannabis production, just because there's not a lot of exposure to the environment. Of course, the caveat there is indoor production can take a tremendous amount of energy. And so, broadly, if we're interested in energy use and uh, carbon production and being concerned about global warming, that's an area where sort of the indoor market conflicts with sort of environmental concerns. We have not done a whole lot of research on that issue, although I do suspect that in the future, making indoor farms as energy efficient as possible will be something that state and local governments look at as they try to reduce carbon emissions.
Okay. And you had mentioned that part of your research has to do with policy and regulations and sort of how that impacts the industry. And I know it's been 4 years since adult use was approved in California. How, if at all, has the environmental impact of cannabis cultivation changed in the last 4 years?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure we can answer um, sort of quantitatively, but I think we can give some qualitative answers to that. First, I think that pretty much any permitted cannabis farm in California is going to have minimal environmental impacts. The regulations are set up such that if you're following the rules and you're able to get your permits, which means your site was approved for cannabis production, the odds that you're doing something that is really environmentally harmful, I think, are pretty low. I think the rules are set up to to sort of prohibit that. So in that way, I think that probably, cannabis you're buying on the legal market in California that's outdoor grown or mixed light grown, which is sort of what we've studied, is probably, I would not worry about its environmental footprint too much. I think it's probably pretty good. Sort of where I think there's a lot less known is because the environmental regulate, I mean, partially because the environmental regulations have been so difficult for many growers to meet. Um, as I said, most farmers are still not doing it in the permanent, are not growing in the permanent market. And so, we don't really know what the environmental effects of those farms are. That's what we're still trying to quantify that. Um, I think it's sort of a balancing act by the state to try to, on one hand, you want to get people compliant and get them in the legal market, which is then we can sort of assure that they're having high environmental standards. Yet, if you make the environmental standards too high and too costly for people to comply, then they're more willing to stay outside, and not join the permitted industry. So it's a fine line that the state's trying to walk there to both encourage compliance while also maintaining a high environmental standards.
So, for those of us who aren't cultivators in California, what are some of those standards and which ones are sort of the hardest ones to meet?
Yeah, I mean, basically, you need to. I mean, and I'm not a lawyer, so if you are a cultivator in California, talk to a consultant or a lawyer before you, say, oh, this is all I have to do. But essentially, I mean, you need to get a permit from um, oftentimes three different sort of state groups. So you need your local permit, which is from your local government. If you're in rural California, that's usually going to be your county government. And the county government will often say will also often have some type of zoning that will say, okay, you can only grow cannabis on land that's zoned this way, has this soil type, and this slope, is located so far from public land and so far from schools, and all of these other things. So basically that sort of first level of regulation, the zoning regulation, makes it so that you're not going to permit a farm on land that's not appropriate for agricultural production, right? So if you meet that first standard, it basically means you have a parcel that your local municipality has said, okay, this is set up to successfully grow cannabis without there being too much of an environmental threat. So that's the first step, and that's actually a pretty, for a lot of farmers, there's still most counties in California do not allow cannabis cultivation. So um, outdoor cannabis cultivation. And so that's actually really a big challenge. Then you oftentimes need to show that you have a water right, right? So that you have enough water to grow cannabis before you can get a permit. And so this can be sort of a combination of dealing with the state water boards as well as the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I don't understand completely the minutia of all of the regulations there, but essentially, you need to show that you have enough water to grow cannabis without taking water from streams at the time of year where it would be impactful. So, a good example of uh, the difference between cannabis and other agriculture is, all of these North Coast farms. Some of them have water rights to draw water from the rivers to irrigate their crop, but they're not allowed to draw water during the summer. So they can only draw water from essentially November until March.
Hmm.
Of course, when they need the water is the summer, which
Right.
is, and so that means essentially their water right is only good to take water out for storage. It's not good to actually irrigate directly on plants, where most other farmers in California, they're irrigating in the summer directly on their plants, from the water system, the water rights that they have. So this is one of those differences. You also need to, when you're going through and getting your permits, you need to have, your roads need to be up to standards. Um, and this is somewhat disputed, and I've heard lawyers say both things, but if you're doing any production or any manufacturing or processing on your farm, and it becomes sort of a manufacturing center, then all of a sudden everything in your facility needs to be ADA compliant. So you need to have an ADA bathroom. You need to have, parking spots for handicapped people. This is all fine, but if we think of this as all just happening at a small farm out in the woods, all of a sudden that's a big burden when, somebody would normally just let the person trimming go to the bathroom in their house, and now they have to build a ADA compliant bathroom
Hmm.
to have the trimmer go to the bathroom somewhere. It becomes difficult. So there's, sort of all these different layers of regulations that I think have made the process both high performing. So if you meet the standard, I think you are performing really high. But the bar is also so high that for some growers, it's just very difficult to figure out how to meet the standards and get the permits.
Okay. Well, now I'm going to put you on the spot and give
Hmm.
you the magic wand. And that if you were in charge and you're able to either remove some regulations or maybe enact some new ones to really sort of reduce the environmental impact of cannabis cultivation, what would you do?
I mean, I think for me, it's the main thing is getting more people into the regulated market. And I think we do that probably through two things. First, we need to have more help for farmers who are trying to join the regulated market. I mean, if you think of a small cannabis farmer who's been growing cannabis for 10 years in Humboldt County, and they have a good supply chain on the unregulated market, and they can sell it for cash, and they know what they're doing. The incentives to join the regulated market are not that high, and and the barriers to get there are pretty high as far as getting, just working through all the permits. Especially if we think about, not I don't want to generalize about cannabis farmers, but many of the people who have been active in the in illicit industry probably don't have, the networks and connections that make it easy to join the permitted industry. And so I think the state can step up in as far as like helping lower those barriers to compliance. So, having some free consulting for cannabis farmers, having peer-to-peer mentoring for cannabis farmers, having some programs that where the state is willing to pay for some of the cost of helping these farmers get into the regulated market. So that's the first thing I would do is somehow reduce the barriers to compliance, and I think the state can do that without lowering their standards through supplying help to the farmers, to work through this process for the first time. And then the second thing is, eventually there needs to be some type of enforcement on the non-regulated farmers, right? So that they don't have the incentive to stay in the regulated market. This is a really tricky question because a lot of the unregulated farmers are not doing anything environmentally wrong. We know many of them are sustainable farmers, and they're just making a living, on these small farms. And so, we don't want to sort of bring the hammer down on people at the same time, without some threat of of enforcement against non-regulated farms. It's hard to see why a lot of people would get into the regulated industry. So part of the problem, and this is sort of the elephant in the room that policymakers have always struggled to deal with, is the fact that California just produces far, far, far more cannabis than it consumes. So right now, there's no way to distribute cannabis that's legally grown in California outside the state, right? So we can't sell our cannabis to Illinois, even though it's now legal to smoke cannabis there, right? And so basically, that means that if every farmer were to join the legal market, there would simply be way too much cannabis in California. It would swamp the legal market. Um, and so eventually, there needs to be some way for cannabis farmers in California to sell their cannabis legally outside of the state. Federally, that's not possible now. Again, I don't know the minutia of the laws, but that's really sort of one of the underlying problems is simply there's an oversupply of cannabis for how much is consumed in California, and there needs to be some way for California farmers to sell outside of the state. And once there's a legal pathway to do that, then I think we'll see more farmers get on board and join the regulated market.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And I always find it interesting to think when cannabis does finally become federally legal and you can sell across state lines, where is the Napa Valley of cannabis going to crop up?
Yeah.
I suspect there'll be quite a bit of cannabis coming from California just with the experience of the growers out there.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that, that's really I mean, that's really the long-term solution, right? Is some federal legalization in some form such that farmers in California can export legally. And when that happens, I think we'll probably see a lot more people get into the legal market. Um,
All right, and wrapping up here, I was curious to ask you sort of how has cannabis cultivation, if at all, how have the practices changed over the years, and have those changes been better or worse for the environment?
that's a great question. And I mean, one thing that I would say is we still, as sort of a research community, are just scratching the surface to understand the cultivation methods. Um, I think relative to sort of other agricultural crops, there's just a huge diversity in the way people produce cannabis and grow cannabis on farms. I mean, it's one of the delightful things about working in this area is every cannabis farmer has sort of their own secret twist, right? That they like to do that they think helps them produce the best cannabis in, whatever little niche ecosystem they're growing. And so, there's this huge heterogeneous sort of movement and or there's this big diversity of growing methods in cannabis. Um, The one thing that we've been able to sort of quantify a little bit through the satellite imagery that we use is um, during earlier times in California, essentially during medical cannabis, you could grow up to 99 plants and feel pretty safe of not having enforcement actions against you. And so then, because it was regulated by the number of plants, a lot of people grew these massive trees. They were, interested in how can I get the most production from 99 plants? And the way to do that was to just grow these really, really huge cannabis plants. The new regulations in California are all based on square foot. So, you can grow as many plants as you want, but you do it in, 10,000 square feet or 20,000 square feet or 5,000 square feet, depending on the permit you have. And so the production practices have changed to much smaller plants um, and sort of packing them in tightly. The other thing, and so, we've seen a shift from, a number of big plants to many, many more smaller plants. I mean, and then the other thing that we've seen is mixed light and double cropping becoming really common. So if you can do some type of uh, light depth, you can in most of California get two crops a season, and this is becoming super common. And I would say I don't know if the majority of farmers are doing it yet, but certainly a large percentage of farmers are now doing more than one crop a year by doing some light manipulation.
Yeah, and I'm curious, are they using autoflower varieties more often too?
That's a good question. I mean, I've talked to some growers who are, uh, but I wouldn't be able to put sort of a percentage on that at all. I would have no idea. That's a good question, though.
Yeah, sure. No, I'm curious. I know that the
Yeah.
folks up at Oregon CBD, we've talked to Seth Crawford before, and they're really big believers in autoflower that that's going to be the future. But maybe they're
Mhm.
maybe they're a little too far ahead. Maybe that hasn't caught up quite yet. But
No,
it's definitely interesting.
it's no, it is definitely an interesting technology and something that yeah, I mean, if it works, right, then
Yeah.
I think yeah, it certainly fits that style of production.
Yeah, and as you mentioned too, some of these folks have been growing cannabis for decades, and they have their methods that work, and maybe they're not
Absolutely.
willing to change quite yet too, which is fine. There's definitely something to be said for experience.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
Finally, one more thing I wanted to ask you: are there any new innovations in cultivation that have you excited or that you're particularly interested in?
That's a great question. Um,
It's okay if there's not.
well, no, I mean, I've seen some really cool things. I mean, one of the neatest things I've seen is there's actually some dry farmers up in Humboldt County
Hmm,
who cultivate with no irrigation at all, and it's a very specific area where they have they're on this like floodplain basically, and the water table's fairly shallow, and
hmm,
it's this really fine porous soil, and they basically plant right into this porous soil, and as the top of the soil, and they leave it, they make everything bare underneath the cannabis, so like there's no, it's just bare soil, and basically as the soil heats up, it pulls up water from below and basically irrigates the plant that way.
wow.
And it's really cool. There's some great videos. If you just look up dry farming cannabis, Humboldt County, you'll find some great YouTube videos of it. It's totally wild. I mean, it looks it looks totally different. And so I guess that's one. I mean, that's a technology that's like very specific to that area, but is definitely pretty cool. I mean, the other thing that, and this is indoor cultivation, which I'm not an expert in at all, but I have had some conversations with people who have had careers in big agricultural indoor cultivation systems, growing massive quantities of cucumbers or tomatoes, and they still sort of think that the technologies used by the average indoor cannabis farmer are like far from optimal. And
Hmm.
they say like relative to the type of production you might see in the Netherlands for their indoor tomato production or cucumber production or strawberry production, cannabis still actually has a long way to go to sort of meet those standards. And so, that'll be interesting to see when these people who aren't experts in cannabis, but are experts in like super efficient, indoor and greenhouse growing, feel more comfortable jumping into this market. What innovations they bring with them as far as technology and things like that.
That's a common refrain with a lot of these conversations I've been having, is that there's still a lot to learn and there's still a lot of room for improvement in all facets of the cannabis industry, which is what makes it so interesting and so exciting for us. But all right, I think I've kept you, Van, long enough. I want to thank you again for joining us today, and look forward to meeting you out in Pasadena and hearing you talk more about the environmental impacts of cannabis cultivation on the panel that you'll be participating on. So until then.
Yep. See you later.
I hope you enjoy my conversation with Van Butsic. Check out the links in the show description to learn more about the topics we discussed. And thanks again to our sponsor, Colorado Seed. Our next episode will drop February 24th. In the meantime, please go to canmedevents.com/coffeetalk and sign up for email updates. That will enter you into a drawing to win 2 tickets to our CannMed 2021 VIP dinner and keep you up to date with all things CannMed 2021. If social media is your thing, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Just search for CannMed Events. And lastly, if you are listening via a podcast app, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so that new episodes automatically download to your device. And please leave us a 5-star review as well. All right, that's it from us. Stay safe, stay healthy, and be sure to come back for the next episode of CannMed Coffee Talk.